If you are just joining us here on CBSN, we have some news to report. President Obama has issued an executive order taking steps to address what he calls the national emergency with respect to significant malicious cyber-related activities when it comes to the United States election cycle. Joining us to talk about this now on the telephone is Beth Knobel. She is a former CBS News Moscow bureau chief, and she's also a professor now at Fordham University. Beth, so I want to get your reaction first to the executive order by the president and the statement that he released right after it.
Well, Brad, one of the things I've been trying to think back to is the last time that there was this kind of an expulsion being done. One of the things that this executive order says is that 35 Russian diplomats need to leave the U.S. Some of them were given just 72 hours to pack up and get out. And I'm just thinking back, and it's very hard to remember, in my experience, anything that goes, that level of expulsions going back many, many years. I think the question is really, what's Russia going to do, and are we going to see the same kind of tit-for-tat expulsion of American diplomats in Russia that we saw during the Cold War?
And that was actually going to be my next question to you, Beth, given your years of reporting from Russia. How do you think Vladimir Putin specifically will take this?
Well, Vlad, I'd be very surprised if the Russians don't match this, if not exactly tit for tat, then at least by sending some American diplomats out of the country. Some of the other things that this does, are probably more in name than, one of the things that this order does is it bans some of the officials of Russian military intelligence and puts them on sanctions list and keeps them from traveling to the U.S. But these aren't exactly people you'd expect to be showing up in the U.S. anyway. Anytime you have the level of, several dozen people leaving your embassies and consulates, then that is a big issue. And I think that's where we're probably likely to see Putin come in fairly quickly.
Yeah, it's interesting. He names in this executive order members of the GRU, the FSB, which is the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation. I mean, these are intelligence agencies. And I wonder, and he says that they've been harassing U.S. diplomats. That's something that seems to be, has been lost in the reporting over the hacking. What do you know about that, if anything?
Well, there has been a lot of harassment of American and other foreign diplomats in Russia going back many years. It's sort of low-level things where people are being followed. They are often being videotaped. There have been times where foreign diplomats have been lured into various kinds of traps. Usually it's a married diplomat being brought into a hotel room to meet with a young lady, and that is used as blackmail against him. Just there's the whole atmosphere in Russia over the last, I would say, 10 years has really turned a little bit sinister overall for the American diplomats. When I first moved over there in the early 90s, there was a feeling of real excitement about getting to know foreigners, and even Russian officials, I think, had a very open mind to meeting their American counterparts, and that has really gotten tougher and harder over the years as relations between the two countries have become stressed, and think this is another sign of just how stressed the relations have become today. I really, myself, can't think of any time that I've been involved in Russia where the relations have been this tense.
Beth, the other thing that I'm struck by in the statement by President Obama is he says, quote, these data theft and disclosure activities could only have been directed by the highest levels of the Russian government. Are we to read that as pointing to Vladimir Putin?
Absolutely. One of the things that I think not everyone in America understands, because our system is really so different here, is that the amount of decision-making that Putin makes personally is mind-boggling. People in various ministries and in the Kremlin are so afraid of making a decision that will not please Putin that they basically ask him to make all important decisions. which is not the way it works in America, where we have very strong departments that carry on the work of the government. It's really one-man rule in Russia. And I have no doubt that Vladimir Putin was personally involved and gave the okay for the kinds of hacking activities that we've seen over the past few months.
Beth, stand by. I want to bring in Steven Portnoy. He is CBS Radio News congressional correspondent and also covers the White House. He's joining us now as well. Steven, we already read for our viewers a statement by Senator Chuck Schumer. What else are you hearing from the Congress?
Well, the Speaker, Paul Ryan, has just released a statement saying that this action is overdue. What I'll be watching very closely, Vlad, is the extent to which President-elect Trump responds to this. As you know, last night he engaged with reporters outside the Mar-a-Lago Club and said that when asked about the strong support in the Congress for sanctions against Russia, that we all ought to move on with our lives. Today, his spokesman, Sean Spicer, said that he wasn't quite sure what all this talk about Russia sanctions was all about. He suggested that perhaps underlying it was the notion that there's some illegitimacy to Donald Trump's victory in the election. And he also said, underlying the continued skepticism that the president-elect has with respect to this issue, that the intelligence community ought to show more proof that the Russians were in fact behind this. What has happened today, Vlad, is a remarkable escalation of the tension between the United States and Russia. Just looking now at a statement from the State Department talking about the harassment of American diplomats in Moscow involving arbitrary police stops, physical assault, and the broadcast on Russian state television of personal details about American personnel that put them at risk.
Steven, and you raise a good point about how the president-elect is going to react. We already had a little bit of reaction from him as well as his spokesperson. But is there bipartisan support right now in the House for this action that President Obama is taking? It's interesting. The Trump camp keeps saying that this appears to be an attempt to somehow delegitimize his presidency. I don't see that from the Congress. It seems to me that what the Congress is saying is, look, it appears that Russia tried to tamper with the election, and that means that exposes us in a number of ways, and we should fix that regardless of who won the election.
The top Republicans in the House and Senate are speaking with one voice on this, that the Russian hacking, and they don't doubt that it's Russian, needs to be fully and thoroughly investigated by both houses of Congress, and that the United States ought to have a formal, forceful response to Vladimir Putin. The president-elect is going to have to come to grips with the fact that the majority of his own party in both houses of Congress is not friendly towards Vladimir Putin, certainly not as friendly as the president-elect appears to be.
All right, Steven Portnoy, who is CBS Radio News correspondent covering the Congress and the White House. I know you got to run. Steven, thank you so much for your insights. We're still on the phone with Beth Knobel. She is a former CBS News Moscow bureau chief and also a professor at Fordham University. Beth, I just want to read you the statement that Steven was referencing from Speaker of the House Paul Ryan. He says, quote, Russia does not share America's interests. In fact, it has consistently sought to undermine them, sowing dangerous instability around the world. While today's actions by the administration is overdue, it is an appropriate way to end 8 years of failed policy with Russia, and it serves as a prime example of this administration's ineffective foreign policy that has left America weaker in the eyes of the world. So on one hand, sort of saying that this is the right thing to do, but on the other hand, sort of attacking the Obama administration, which I guess is expected. But I wonder, Beth, when you look at what President Obama is saying in his statement, what Speaker Ryan is saying, what Senator Schumer and other members of Congress are saying, and then you hear President-elect Trump say that we should all move on with our lives, how does Vladimir Putin read that? If you're Putin and you are a former KGB officer who is, as you said earlier to me, one-man rule in Russia, how does he read that?
Well, I think Vladimir Putin is still overjoyed that Donald Trump was the winner of this election. And if you remember back to history, in 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev became leader, just before he became leader, he met with the then British leader, Margaret Thatcher. And she said, you know, this is a man that we can do business with about Gorbachev. And it turned out to be right. And a lot happened to improve relations between the Soviet Union and the West, and then led to the fall of the Soviet Union in the end. So I think Vladimir Putin looks at Donald Trump today and says, okay, this is a man that I can do business with. And he is probably very, very glad that Hillary Clinton did not win. She tried to reset relations with Russia when she became Secretary of State, and it was a disaster. The fact that if you'll remember, she presented Russia with this reset button, and someone at the State Department got the word on the button in Russian wrong. And that's sort of a symbol for everything that's gone wrong over the last few years between Obama and Trump. Now, that said, Trump has to look at this, and one of the things that the president said today is that they are going to release more information about what Russia has been doing in its hacking. They are going to give Americans and the president-elect what will probably be very strong evidence that Russia really was behind all of this hacking. So if you're Donald Trump, I think you have to look at this and take seriously the information that you're getting from intelligence, because you are going to be in the hot seat starting on January 20th, and you must keep America's best interests in mind.
I want to discuss something you just mentioned, Beth, that Vladimir Putin perhaps sees the president-elect as someone he can do business with. President-elect Trump has said all along that he feels the same way, that he thinks that he will be able to get along with Russia, that he and Vladimir Putin may be able together to, for example, end the Syrian conflict. And you see it in the words of Speaker Paul Ryan, where he says that this administration, meaning President Obama's administration, has been ineffective in dealing with Russia. So when you say that he sees President-elect Trump as somebody he can do business with, what kind of business?
Well, a lot of what Russia has done over the Putin years has been to make Putin a player in the world. That Russia felt going into the Putin years that it was not getting the respect that it should have from the entire world community, including the United States. And so if you look at what a lot of Russia is doing today, you can see it all through the lens of, hey, we are a great power. We are a great nation. Look at Syria. A lot of Russians say, you know, we really maybe don't even belong in Syria. But I think the main reason that Russia is there is to prove that it is a player on the world stage. If you look at other things that have gone on economically in Russia, the fact that they put sanctions on America and the European Union after we put sanctions on, sort of to say, oh, well, you know, we're a great world power. We can hurt your economy the same way you're trying to hurt our economy. So I think that Putin thinks that Trump is going to be someone with whom he can talk. He can present the Russian side of him. He probably thinks he can get a fair shake. That he can stress the areas where Russia and the United States have things that they can share. They both have interest in bringing peace to the Middle East, in dealing with Iran, in cooperating further in space. So there definitely are places where cooperation has happened and can continue to happen. But that said, you know, one thing that is particularly important is that the nominee for Secretary of State is someone who has spent a lot of time in Russia, knows Putin, has relations with him, and the sanctions that were already in place have a huge effect on Exxon and Mobil. That firm is not allowed to do business anymore with its main partner in Russia because that main partner is under sanctions. So if Rex Tillerson, the former, you know, the head of Exxon, is in fact confirmed as Secretary of State, this is going to create a whole other playing field through which to look at Russian-American relations. You
know, I'm also interested, it is interesting, I should say, Beth, that we are only a couple of days away from the 25th anniversary of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And Mikhail Gorbachev has actually been doing interviews, and he's been talking to members of the media. And one of the things that I find really sort of fascinating from the Russian perspective is some of the things that have frustrated President Obama and other countries in the West are things that are being seen positively in Russia that have elevated Vladimir Putin's numbers among his own people. And even Gorbachev sort of says, and I'm quoting here from a newspaper interview that he did, that the Crimea situation, the annexation of Crimea, is something that should be celebrated, not sanctioned. As Vladimir Putin has undertaken this move to elevate Russia to the level that it was perhaps back in the days when you were there, I wonder if from the Russian perspective, these are all good things, and the fact that the United States is even retaliating this way means that they are able to go toe-to-toe with the U.S.
Well, Vlad, it's sort of a mix. I think that Putin remains very, very popular in Russia. His popularity ratings are still very high. He is bolstered in that by the fact that television is pretty much completely under government control in Russia, and so people are fed a diet of very, very pro-Putin television day in and day out, which helps bolster his popularity. I think part of it is that Russians really appreciate strong leaders. One of the reasons that Putin looks so strong is that his predecessor, Russian President Boris Yeltsin, was seen as weak. He had health issues. He apparently suffered with alcoholism as well. And so Putin, to his people, is seen as the kind of strong leader that Russians have wanted going back historically. But that said, there have been sanctions put in place by the West on Russia. There have been counter-sanctions that have come back to the West from Russia. And those sanctions have had a pretty dramatic effect on the Russian economy. Their economy is shrinking. The ruble has tanked. Most of my Russian friends are either unemployed or underemployed. They're going through their reserves of gold at a high rate. The economy is just not strong, and it was growing and doing quite well before those whole sanctions and counter-sanctions. So on the one hand, Russians like a strong leader. On the other hand, they are feeling it in their pocketbooks.
All right, so Beth, this is a pretty strong action by the President of the United States, but you and I have lived through, certainly when the Soviet Union was still a power, you know, there was the proxy war in Afghanistan, and certainly before our time, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis. As you know, 1984, the Russians boycotted the Summer Olympics in Los Angeles. The United States boycotted the Summer Olympics in 1980. I mean, is this as bad as that? Or, in other words, can this get worse? Or is this just, you know, something to be expected? It's diplomacy in action, but we've had it much worse with the Russians.
Well, there have been some pretty bad times. I mean, the Cuban Missile Crisis had the two nations really on the brink of nuclear war. So it's not at that level yet, and I don't think anybody really wants to be. But, you know, one of the things that, you know, I personally worry about with all this hacking going on is, you know, the extent to which missile systems are safe. And there have been some people just in recent days who've raised questions about the security about Russian nuclear weapons and American nuclear weapons. And, you know, if Russian hackers are able to hack into our systems, how do we know that there's not going to, you know, they're not going to get hold of missiles? And military experts I talked to assure me that this is not going to happen. But, you know, there have been accidents and close calls over the past 30 years. So those are the sorts of things that nobody really wants. I don't think anybody on either side wants us to be back on the brink of a nuclear war or facing the situation where we don't think that the nuclear arsenals are safe or subject to hacking. But at the same time, the relations between our two countries are really under great stress. In recent memory, I cannot remember a time where there has been more stress, and I think that today's actions by President Obama are going to probably add to that in the short run. One last thing to keep in mind is that Russia is about to go on vacation. Russians give their gifts to each other not on Christmas, but on New Year's, and so the country pretty much shuts down from the 31st of December through Russian Orthodox Christmas on the 7th of January. So it's a little hard to know if we're going to see a quick response before we get to New Year's Eve and everybody goes off, or if Putin is going to take that holiday period and sort of take a step back and do some deep thinking about how to respond to today's actions.
All right, we're just seeing right now from the Interfax news agency, this is coming to us from Reuters, that the foreign minister or the foreign ministry commissioner for human rights, democracy, and the rule of law in Russia, Konstantin Dolgov, is saying that these new U.S. sanctions on Russia are counterproductive and will harm a restoration of bilateral ties. So that's just in. Beth, I want to ask you, so what is, and you may not be familiar with this, but I think you will be familiar with, so first part of the question is what happens, what is the process for these diplomats and these other individuals to be expelled from the country? And more interestingly, what happens to them when they arrive in Russia?
Well, so expulsions happen on a regular basis. Usually it's one person being asked to leave because the U.S. has suspicions that they are involved in some kind of espionage. For example, I was acquainted with somebody at the Russian consulate in New York, and he was basically here one day and gone the next, literally given 24 hours to pack his things and leave. And so those people would return to probably their home city or to Moscow and would be reassigned in some way by their home agency. Now, if they were really, in fact, diplomats, then they would be reassigned to some job by the foreign ministry. If they were, in fact, intelligence officers acting undercover, then they would be reassigned by the whichever intelligence service they work for. That Russia actually has a few.
And I'm guessing once you're expelled, you're not coming back, right, at any point? I mean, or maybe you can, but I would wonder about that.
No, you are not.
You're not coming
back.
Yeah, yeah. So what's interesting also is as we look at these pictures of Vladimir Putin, you know, again, I wonder, as we all wait to see what the president-elect is going to say and how he is going to respond to the actions taken by President Obama, if there really is going to be any kind of daylight between President-elect Trump and Vladimir Putin. In other words, if you had to tick off a list of things that they could get to work on January 21st, even with these sanctions that the Obama administration is putting into place, even if the president-elect left them in place, what could be some of those things? What could be some of those priorities?
Well, you know, I would think that they need to meet, that the first thing that would be on Trump's agenda is saying, okay, you know, I have a good personality. I am able to find ways to level with people and to create relations with them when I can actually meet them face to face, and that his first priority would be setting up some kind of a meeting where they could talk about issues like the sanctions and like diplomatic efforts in places like Syria, where both countries have ongoing efforts. If you look at Trump's meeting with Obama, you'll see that there was quite an interesting turn in their relationship, that Trump had gone into that meeting having had years and years of criticizing President Obama for all kinds of things, and had said for many years that he really wasn't born in Hawaii. And then when they met, they actually seemed to have quite a positive meeting, and the president-elect said a lot of very positive, upbeat things about President Obama, and that they sort of, you think that they sort of saw more eye to eye when they actually met face to face. So if I were Donald Trump, I would say, Vlad, could you come to Washington, you know, really, really soon?
And I wonder, when we think about Vladimir Putin's character, is he a man who can be finessed? Is he somebody that you can deal with in a full-on diplomatic situation, in other words, with all the courtesies that involves? Or does he respond to another strong personality, another strong man like himself, which Donald Trump has said he is?
So I've seen Putin in close quarters many times over the years that I was in Russia. Met with him with small groups of journalists. I was on the sidelines when Mike Wallace of 60 Minutes interviewed Putin in 2005, an interview that lasted about 2.5 hours. And been at many press conferences with Putin. And so you can see that he's a very, very strategic thinker. He's become even more strategic over the years, and he does respond well to strong personalities. When people attack him, he can do a number of things. I think his most popular response is to attack back. So I remember when Mike Wallace attacked him and sort of saying, you don't really have democracy in this country. It's more like one-party rule. Putin responded by saying, you want to talk to me about democracy? Well, in America, you don't elect your president. You elect electors, and your electors elect the president. That doesn't sound like democracy to me. Who are you to talk to me about democracy? So I've also seen him be exceedingly charming and funny and even a little bit self-deprecating at times. So he can be many different things. He sort of makes a calculation about the way to go. I think that he would sit down with Trump with quite an open mind and really looking to stress areas where things could be different because, in fact, this tense relationship between the U.S. and Russia has hurt Russia a lot. Its economy is in a very bad place because of these sanctions and counter-sanctions. And the Russian economy is based on natural resources, particularly oil and gas. And unless that whole sector can do well, the country will not do well. And that sector cannot do well unless relationships with the U.S. and the West are on solid footing.
Former CBS News Bureau Chief Beth Knobel, it has been a real pleasure talking to you about this. I hope we get to talk on the other side of this hour. We have to take a quick commercial break, but we're going to have a whole lot more on the news out of Washington from President Obama. The sanctions that have now been put into place, 35 Russian operatives have 72 hours to leave the United States as an executive order that the president himself signed, saying that this is because of Russia's hacking into the U.S. election and ending it by saying that in the coming days, his administration will be providing a report to Congress about Russia's efforts to interfere in our election, as well as malicious cyber activity related to our election cycle in previous elections. Quick break. We'll be right back.